Welcome, everyone. I'm Karin Christensen with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, America's First Civil Rights Movement, with Kate Masur and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the library has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. Today's program is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. Currently, the Newberry is open to readers and visitors. You can visit our website, newberry.org, to make an appointment to do research in the reading rooms, or you can stop by the library without an appointment Tuesday through Saturday to visit our exhibition halls. Our Rosenberg Bookshop is open Wednesday through Saturday as well. Visit the website digital.newberry.org/libertad to learn about our current exhibition and public program series called Viva La Libertad, about the age of revolutions across the Americas in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The exhibition will be open through July 24th. During the program, please enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube. As time permits, our speakers will respond to your questions. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, if they will join us now. Dr. Kate Masur is Associate Professor of History at Northwestern University. She is the author of Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction, the subject of today's discussion. Her other books include An Example for All the Land, Emancipation and the Struggle Over Equality in Washington, D.C., and with Gregory Downs, The World the Civil War Made. Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is Assistant Professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. She is author of Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Home Ownership, which was a semifinalist for the 2019 National Book Award and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2020. Her book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, won the Lannan Cultural Freedom Award for an especially notable book in 2016. Now let me pass things over to Dr. Masur and Dr. Taylor.
Hi, Kate.
Hello, how are you?
I'm great. Super happy to be here to talk about your book. I have an opening question, but the first thing I wanted to say was, I think both of us in this profession, we read a lot of books, this is one of, I can say, like one of the few books that I've read recently that I really felt like I was learning a lot of things that, not just that I didn't know, but that I hadn't quite thought about in the way that you frame them. And I feel like I got a real education in reading this. And, I'm very grateful for that. And I know now that there is not nearly enough time to talk about the pages of questions that I literally have about the book. But just so other people can get some sense of what we're talking about here, the name of this meeting today is America's First Civil Rights Movement. I think obviously most people not only think of the civil rights movement as something that happens after slavery, that the question of Black citizenship is a post-slavery question. But, clearly most people think of the question of Black civil rights as a 20th century phenomenon. And your book is shedding light on a completely different time period in history about the question of Black citizenship, Black belonging, in what became the United States. So why don't you, just to open things up, tell us what your book is about?
Thank you so much. And that I had something to tell you in this book means a huge amount to me, is phenomenal. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And you're one of the people I would most want to have this conversation with. So let me just get into the book. So just to kind of to riff on something you started with, where we think of the civil rights movement or arguments over Black civil rights, race and civil rights as being a post-slavery phenomenon, I think one place we can start with is the realization that there was a lot of post-slavery United States in the period before slavery was finally abolished with the Civil War, right? So I start in a way, I mean, there's a few different ways to talk about this, but one way is I start with the premise that the North, the free states, were post-slavery societies, right? And if you think about it that way, and there were Black people there were African Americans who had, were native to that region for generations. There were African Americans who moved from the slave states to the free states. Once you have, a society where slavery has been abolished, but slavery, of course, is a race-based system in this country and in the Western Hemisphere. So you have these questions of what is the residual of slavery in a post-slavery society? And that plays out in the free states of the United States before it plays out in the Southern states and in a certain sense nationally. And so what the book, in a way, sheds light on is this first iteration of the struggle to define what would be the kind of nature of a post-slavery society. And that first happened in the free states. And then I argue that the lessons learned in that struggle over race and rights in the free states, and I talk a little bit about the slave states too, but the lessons people learned, the lessons that Black people learned, the lessons that white people learned about that struggle, they carried into the Civil War and Reconstruction period when those questions went national in a totally new way, right? And so they had rehearsed these questions mostly at a state level, local level, to some limited extent at the national level before the 1860s. Then, through this explosive, completely cataclysmic war, they had the opportunity, at least the people who had a vision of trying to not only abolish slavery, but create a regime of greater racial equality, had the opportunity to do that in a way that was completely unprecedented because of the Civil War and the moment that emerges from that. And so the last couple of chapters of the book are about that moment and how we end up with the kind of measures that the country did end up with in the 1860s, the first federal civil rights measures, which are the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment.
So we talk about the slavery is a phenomenon, obviously, throughout the Western Hemisphere, but the United States is different because it is a democracy. And so the United States comes into existence with this contradiction of both slavery and freedom. And I wonder the extent to which the newness of the US and at least this ideological commitment to democracy opens up the space for freed people, newly freed Black people in the North. I do think that the way that you frame the North as a post-slavery society is really important. I think that it's something that we take for granted, and I know you mentioned that at the very end of the book, and it's like an aha moment of right. That's right. So these are live questions about what will citizenship look like? Will Black people even be citizens? Can Black people be citizens? But it seems that the newness of the society leaves more openness to determine this, that these are questions that have not been fully formed, questions about citizenship. So not just for Black people, will Black people be citizens and what does that mean? But this seems like a new question in general, like what does it mean to be an American? So I'm wondering if you could talk about how the newness of these questions in general create a space for Black people to insert themselves into these, what we might describe as emerging debates about what it means to be an American?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And the more that I got into the earlier 19th century and the late 18th century, the more tangled these questions about citizenship and kind of national identity, even state identity and state citizenship, which I write a lot about in the book. First of all, everything is like a complete tangled mess, right? So I'm trying to kind of sort out when are people talking about the rights or privileges and immunities of citizenship? When are they talking about the rights of personhood? I think that actually really matters. When are people, because something that accrues to you as a citizen, it's connected to your belonging in a political community, whether it's a state or a nation. But something that you have as a person, you're entitled to it regardless of whether you're from that place or not, right? So there's actually, and I really am committed to talking about this, that there's actually something much more egalitarian and much more liberatory about personhood rights than citizenship rights. And both of those kinds of discussions and terminologies were at play, and sometimes people didn't make very clear distinctions between the two. So that's thing number one, or that's like thing number 37. But then in addition to that, okay, you have the new nation, and then you have these two primary documents, at least as far as I am concerned. Maybe there's a third, but you have the Constitution and you have the Declaration of Independence, two touchstones for Americans now and back then. I would say if there was a third, it would be the Northwest Ordinance, but I don't really want to get into that now. So, okay, the Constitution is the blueprint for American government. And the Constitution, the American Constitution, doesn't define American citizenship. It doesn't say who's a citizen. It doesn't even say much about national citizenship. It also gives huge amounts of power to the states, especially when and where the individual rights of people living within the United States are concerned. And so actually, you know, the Constitution, for all people talk about it now and in the past, it has very, very little to say about—
It's very vague.
It's very vague, and it has, and also let me just add, the Bill of Rights, which people often go to now, I have right to this and right to that because it's the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, whatever, were always at that time, or almost entirely, said to protect people against incursions, encroachments by the federal government, but not by the state. So you had no rights, basically, against your state government. Nobody really did. And it was up to the states to determine how to allocate, you know, sort of rights, privileges, of belonging, of what they might call citizenship. So that's under the Constitution. Incredible abridgments of rights are possible continuously. And all you have to do is think about slavery to think of that, right? But so it's not just that human bondage is constitutional under the United States Constitution and as it's founded, but so are, you know, all kinds of other oppressive laws that discriminate based on race, based on sex, based on poverty and status. And then on the other hand, over here, you have the Declaration of Independence, which is not binding. It has no, you know, kind of legal status in a practical sense, but it's a really important document in terms of being a statement of values for many Americans. And it's the Declaration of Independence, which, you know, most famously says, you know, that all men are created equal, entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, it's not binding. You can't go to court with a claim that your rights under the Declaration of Independence are being violated, but it provides an opening. It provides a thing that Black people in particular can go to and say, look, when you are passing these laws that say I cannot immigrate into a state, or I can't, my children can't attend school, it's clearly violating the principles of the founders. And then as now invoking the founders was supposed to be powerful, you know, was supposed to be like, we're going wrong when we're not doing this. So, so there's a lot. I mean, I would also just say to your question of newness, like there's so much that's not worked out in the beginning of the United States. So they put out these documents, you know, the Declaration in one moment, then they hash out the Constitution to kind of get this government up and running. And then just, you know, there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of lack of clarity about what's possible next. And then you have this phenomenon of abolishing slavery in certain states, doubling down on it in other places, and these questions of race that are incredibly pressing, right? That people really actually care about quite a lot.
I actually want to talk some about the Declaration of Independence, because I think now, especially for for activists and, a whole host of people, we tend to look at it quite cynically because of this contradiction between freedom and bondage, and even now between, what can happen to George Floyd and what the ideals of this country are. But in real time, when the Declaration is created, that these are ideas that people believe in. I understand why this is a mobilizing document for Black people, because it highlights, it makes the contradiction, the hypocrisy of not just slavery, but of their own debasement so crystal clear. But I think for most people who may see, race and racism as this kind of static thing, that is the same thing over time and space, this idea that everyone's always been racist, will be racist, it has never changed, that the power of the Declaration of Independence meant that for some people, for some white people, that it is a basis for them to also challenge a regime, not only of slavery, but of the treatment of Black people in a particular state, in a particular location outside of the South. And I'm raising this because I'm wondering, who are the white allies that African Americans to form this civil rights movement in the age of the revolution in the early 19th century?
Yeah, so first, I would say first of all, that one of the roles that the Declaration of Independence plays is it's a piece of rhetoric. Like, it becomes part of a rhetorical strategy, right? So it's kind of I would say I was thinking more about Black people in this case, of like, if there's something we can grab onto to make the case, this is one piece of it, right? Because the Declaration of Independence does not say, all white people are created equal, right? It says all men are created equal. And so that was out there for them to grab onto, and white Americans also cared about it. And so Black Americans could say, like, this is what you promised. Now, as far as the white allies, so I want to say one other important kind of piece of rhetoric, or of authority that was out there for people to grab onto, and that is the Bible. Although the Bible was constantly and probably more often used to justify slavery, there were passages in the Bible, one in particular that became really important to this movement, that says that God has created of one blood all nations of men, right? So all nations of men, and people at the time used nation and race kind of interchangeably. God has created of one blood all nations of men, or something like that, all nations of men of one blood. And so there's sort of like this scriptural authority that people also turn to. They turn to the golden rule, also the idea of, you should treat your neighbors as you would like to be treated yourselves, as other kinds of authority, for the argument that discrimination based on race is fundamentally wrong, right? It's immoral according to the Bible. They would say it's also wrong in terms of what they consider American values. So you asked about white allies. So these people who we find allying themselves with African Americans in the quest to, for example, repeal the racist laws of the Midwest, like Ohio and Illinois and Indiana, which we can, get more into that, or defending the rights of free Black sailors from Massachusetts and New York and other places who end up incarcerated in Southern prisons under Southern state laws. These are people from a variety of different walks of life, I would say, and they are motivated by different kinds of things. So some are just abolitionists, right? And so on the one hand, these white abolitionists they think slavery is wrong, and they want to see slavery eventually abolished in states that they don't live in. And they also want to see more fairness and equality when it comes to race in their own states. Others, and also I want to sort of say, because I think there continues to be a lot of confusion about who white abolitionists were. They were not only sort of complete, or eventually they were not only kind of very marginal, completely out there characters. I write more about the strand of white abolitionists who were involved in politics. They were not William Lloyd Garrison shredding the Constitution. They were people who thought that if they could use the levers of party politics to actually create policy changes. And actually, they were more likely to be able to do that in their home states, like repealing racist laws, than getting South Carolinians to abolish slavery, right? Like federalism was such, it was actually a much more practical goal to attack the racist policies that you hated in your own state, get people elected to your state legislature, your governorship, than to try to persuade some other state to do things differently. So many of them were very practical. And then I'll just say some of them were also like merchants, business people who were inconvenienced by certain types of racist policies, particularly this issue of Black sailors being incarcerated in southern states. So they weren't necessarily people who ideologically would have always aligned themselves with the most kind of racially egalitarian people, but they had their own reasons for wanting to see these southern state laws that applied to Black travelers coming into southern states repealed. And yeah, I mean, just to get back to your question though about ideology, like the Declaration of Independence, I mean, some of them, held up the Declaration of Independence as an ideal, said that we had moved away from the vision of the founders. And I will just say there's some truth to that. I mean, so one of the things that we find in terms of like thinking about change over time is that in the late 18th century, coinciding with the American Revolution and shortly thereafter, I mean, these early states that abolished slavery, like New York and Pennsylvania, they did not immediately put up laws that barred Black men from voting. They did not put into place the kinds of racially discriminatory laws that Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana later did. And so in the late 18th century, there's actually a stronger current of universalism, of refusing to enact these kinds of racially discriminatory policies. And then you see, as the 19th century kind of gets underway, this sort of reactionary impulse to implement racially discriminatory laws in the new states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois when they come in, and then disenfranchise Black men, at least partially in New York in 1821, then in Pennsylvania in 1838. And so, there's a lot of flux there. And sometimes when white and Black people are critiquing the kinds of racism that they're seeing in the North and the racist policies that they're seeing in the North, and they're saying the founders never intended this, there was some grain of truth to that. I mean, because in the late 18th century, there was actually less of that stuff, at least in formal policy, than there was a little bit later.
So one of the things that you describe, especially in the Northwest, right, is the Black codes, laws that are basically intending to control, manipulate Black people, if not keep them out of the state altogether. I'm wondering if you could walk us through then, given both slavery in the South, a kind of regressive regime that is different from state to state, but a generalized hostility towards Black people. If you could walk us through how what you were describing as a civil rights movement develops out of this. And I will just say that I think one of the most important interventions, contributions that the book makes is to really look at the role of ordinary Black people from many different perches that contribute to what becomes a more generalized movement, even when it is, because of the constraints of federalism, located in, very strongly in particular places in states, that there's a way in which through conventions, through newspapers, that these ideas are generalized and circulate in such a way as to then create the foundations of what we can only describe as the way that you say it, as a social movement that then kind of transforms itself into a political movement that eventually finds expression in the kind of, highest ranks of government. How does this happen under such reactionary, regressive conditions that Black people are facing?
That's the question that's what I'm trying to show in the book, right? I mean, that's the question, is how does this happen? And I have to say, I mean, I got so interested in how a social movement moves from the absolute periphery into politics, kind of locally at the state level, and then, ends up at the national level. And for me, there were so many resonances with present day questions, also about coalition building, about sort of radicals and liberals. I mean, it's all kind of in there. And so just let me start by saying, you alluded to these laws. So Ohio is the first state to come into the Union out of the Northwest Territory, and it kind of sets the stage for what other states are going to do. They, upon becoming a state, Ohio passes laws that require free Black people living in the state to register with with county officials. They prohibit African Americans from testifying in court cases involving whites. When they start up a statewide school system, they say the schools are for white students only, so they're essentially banning Black students from public education. And then by the Ohio Constitution, only white men are allowed to vote. And others, Northwest states, follow suit, although interestingly, the ones that really do this are Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, the ones that border on the Ohio River, and they are bordering on slave states. And I got really fascinated by this internal border in a period when state to state migration, these states are essentially trying to put up legal walls against Black migration from the slave states, whether it's free Black people who, got free in a place like Kentucky or Virginia and wanted to migrate into a free state, or people who were enslaved who were escaping. They're trying, by these laws, it's pretty clear when the legislators of these states talk about the laws, they are trying to discourage Black migration and trying to show Black people that if they come here, they're not going to be welcome, their lives are not going to be very good, and so on. But one thing to say, first of all, is that, and I think sometimes we forget this, like, not all white people ever approved of those laws in the first place, right? So even though they passed, they were always contested even by white people. And this is just to, randomly sort of make a connection to the present, but, living in Trump's America, writing this book in Trump's America, I mean, I just was constantly thinking about how just because, this person is the president doesn't mean that, like, even 51% of Americans support him. And so you have to kind of keep in mind, right, that whoever is the government, they may or may not have a lot of support from even the voting population. Right. Anyway, so these laws are there, but African Americans continue to migrate into these southern Midwestern states in large numbers. And you can't really, there's no way looking at census data that you can visibly see that those laws would have actually effectively diminished Black migration into those states. In other words, Black migration increased, or Black population of those states increased at about the same rate as white population. And so, and then people at the time would comment on, like, well, we try to have these laws, but they obviously aren't effective anyway, because it seemed like by the choices that African Americans were making in terms of migration, they would rather live in Ohio than Virginia, if possible, or at least many would, right? And there were large communities of free African Americans in these lower Midwest states where people were able to farm, they were able to live independently, they were able to form their own churches, their own schools, and kind of have a life outside of the regime of slavery that would have been, I mean, there are a lot of really interesting free Black communities in the slave states too, so I don't want to act like, that didn't exist, but I mean, people were clearly often making the choice to move into free states.
But you also make the point that after Nat Turner's rebellion, that the laws get, that there's a targeting of free Black communities. And so it would make sense that that people, freed Black people, would not, really want to live in that close proximity.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, after Nat Turner's rebellion, a lot of Southern states make life a lot more difficult for free Black people. And that is going to be one of those forces that pushes people to want to leave if they can leave. And you see in response, for instance, Ohio debates strengthening their anti-Black laws in 1831 and 1832 because they're talking about Nat Turner's rebellion. They're like, oh, Virginia's going to make, push all these people out and they're going to come into our state. And so there's also just a lot of really interesting, stuff going on about people's awareness of what's going on in other places in these other jurisdictions. But so pretty quickly we see, as early as there are sources available for, we see Black people in particular pushing back against these laws. And there's a great series of articles from 1818 that I found in a Quaker-run newspaper by a guy who went by the name of David Blackmore, and who identified himself as African American, basically just critiquing the Ohio Black laws and saying, these are, first of all, ineffective. They're not accomplishing what people think they're supposed to, and they're totally unjust and unfair. He uses the Declaration of Independence and the Bible to kind of say, look, these violate our values. And their terrible policy, and he gives this example of, it's basically like, if somebody tries to throw me out of this state because I haven't registered, I'm just going to come back in. And he kind of describes how he would just cross back in at another place in the Ohio River. And so, eventually, the more that African Americans, and I use Ohio a lot because also that was the state where the movement for repeal of these laws was most successful. And that has to do with a variety of different factors. But Black populations in Ohio are really fascinating to me. And there was the city of Cincinnati, which is right on the Ohio River, a horrible place for African Americans in some ways, because people could come over. There were attempted kidnappings. There were people trying to steal people back into slavery. And yet this was also a place where there was an underground railroad. There were Black churches, there were schools, there were white abolitionists, there was an abolitionist newspaper. Cleveland is interesting because it's in the Western Reserve. And so it's the most kind of adamantly abolitionist among white people area. That's where Oberlin eventually is. And then Columbus is also really interesting as the state capital. And a lot of politically minded Black people in Columbus are directly lobbying the state government. And so what we start to see by the 1830s is African Americans organizing in their local communities, and then statewide by 1837, a petition campaign. And this is, another sort of really interesting thing. How do you make a difference in politics when you don't have a lot of people? And then in this particular case where Black men couldn't even vote. And so they start to petition the state legislature, basically by convention. Anybody can petition, right? So petitioning is not limited to citizens, it's not limited to men, it's not limited to white people. So there's a kind of obligation that the state legislature has to respond in some way to these petitions. Now, usually the response is, so they'll have a subcommittee that looks into the petition to repeal these racist laws. And Black people are petitioning for repeal, white people are too. And the state legislature will come back and say, well, we think the laws are great. We really need the laws. But then maybe there's one member of the committee that files a minority report that says the laws are horrible, we have to remove them. Then you have the press that picks up these reports and distributes them. And the anti-slavery kind of pro-civil rights press will use this to amplify either what they see as like the evils of the Ohio legislature, or, let's prop up the guys who are arguing that these laws have to go. And so you see the kind of growing circulation of these ideas and these claims for repeal. But
some of them eventually find themselves in wider political expression with the advent of third parties,
right?
The Liberty Party, and then ultimately the Republican Party.
Yeah. So they're able to, and again, this is more the people, white men can vote, right? And so you're going to have to figure out, if you want to get these laws repealed, how to get enough white people on the side of repeal to vote people in who are going to repeal. But then there are ways of having kind of getting a wedge in by mobilizing a third party that can get people elected to state office. They're never going to have a majority or anything remotely close to that, but that they could wield what they called, even then, wield the balance of power in the state legislature. So the way that the Black laws get repealed in Ohio is there's enough of these, by that time, Free Soil Party people in the state legislature, and they basically say, whichever party, the Whigs or the Democrats, will repeal the Black laws, we'll throw our weight with them for the other agenda items that they care about. So they want patronage had a lot to do with it. They wanted whichever party wants to be able to choose their U.S. senator. These very tiny, in the end, it was 2 people would put their weight to one side or the other. Whoever bargained with them to agree to repeal the Black laws to get sort of what they wanted if they were in the majority. Sorry, I didn't say the important thing, which is closely divided legislature, right? And so where 2 people mattered, which party was going to be in the majority. And that's how they repeal the Black laws.
Which is, to me, is fascinating. And not to go down a rabbit hole, but this was inevitable to happen. This issue of the police powers and state government, it's fascinating. So basically, within state governments, they have the capacity to dictate the laws and the terms by which citizens of the state relate to each other. And individual rights are sacrificed on the realm of whatever is going to protect the public, which is sort of loosely grouped under this thing called policing powers of the state. And so it really is, I think it speaks to the movement quality or character of what you're describing, the ability to actually transform these state laws, to get rid of these anti-Black Black laws, Black codes, which many people are familiar with as a post-slavery phenomenon in the South, right? That in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the South come up with these Black codes to basically continue to control Black people by other means than slavery, but to get them back to a condition as close as possible. But there's this phenomenon of these Black codes that exist in the Midwest and in places in the North prior to this that are less about controlling Black labor and more about keeping Black people out. And so one of the things that is made really clear to me is the way that you frame how some of the discussion about the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is framed as a kind of helter-skelter process that is thrown together in the aftermath of the war, because it's clear that the white South will not accept the new condition of newly freed Black people. And so in response to their creation of Black codes, there's this crazy process that delivers the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And I think that what you really successfully demonstrate is that, regardless of the particular process that creates the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is the first kind of iteration of civil rights and law in the United States, that this is in some ways the culmination of a very long process that is deliberating and debating this tension between the rights of states within a federal government, an actual country, and how to mediate the rights of Black people within that. I wonder if you could speak, because that to me is the kind of fruition of the civil rights movement, is helping to create the terms of the debate that the Civil Rights Act is being parsed out, and the language, that these aren't actual new questions. By this time, these are questions that have been hashed out in many different places before.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And I think, sometimes when people ask me, well, where did you get the idea for this book? That's like sometimes the first question that somebody will ask. And it's one of the answers to that is, my first book was on Reconstruction in Washington, D.C., and I was finishing that book and writing the introduction to it. And one of the phenomena about Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, which I wrote about in my first book, and it's in this, is, Congress has full jurisdiction over D.C. in a way that it does not over the states because of the weirdness of federalism and whatever. And so when the Republicans come into power nationally in 1861, they immediately start implementing their vision. It's kind of like a pure place for them to implement their vision on the District of Columbia. And not only do they abolish slavery, which you might expect coming, but they also repeal the racist Black laws of the District of Columbia that discriminated against free Black people. And again, this might seem obvious, but it's not always obvious. Like, if you kept those laws in place, you would have abolished slavery, and then everyone is free, but you have all these racially discriminatory laws that have always in DC and other places cast Black people as second-class citizens, made them subject to humiliation, regulated them in all kinds of ways that white people were not regulated. So not only do the Republicans in DC, when the Civil War starts, immediately abolish slavery, but they repeal the Black laws. In other words, creating a regime of racial equality before the law. And so I was finishing my first book, and I was like, okay, so, this party comes into Washington with this vision. It's clear that they do, because they do it and they don't even debate it that much. Where did they get that vision? Because they're all Northerners. Right? And so I was like, who wrote the book showing where the vision of kind of race and law and equality of the Republicans came from? And there was no such book, right? And so that's one of the origins of this book, is trying to write the book that explains. And I mean, it comes from a different strand of historiography too, which is this representation of the white North as exclusively racist, right? Like, if nobody no white Northerners had any idea of racial equality, and they were all just as bad as, white Southerners or whatever, then you could never have had a Republican Party coming to power and doing that to the District of Columbia and whatever else. And so there has to be a story there. And that's partly the story that I wanted to tell. I think I lost track of your question, but I mean, so what they then, so they then, this is the culmination of the book, right? Is that these Republicans, who have many of them literally the white guys who are in office in the 1860s in Congress, were literally part of this civil rights movement from beforehand. I mean, they were people who got elected through these third-party politics, or people who were involved in these third-party politics all along, like Salmon Chase or Henry Wilson, Salmon Chase from Ohio, Henry Wilson from Massachusetts. And so they get into office. And first, in the Civil War, they're going to do their vision of kind of racial equality and civil rights, which, by the way, parenthetically, does not include voting rights at that time, where they constitutionally believe they can do it at first. And then they're going to blow up the Constitution after the war is over, right? Don't literally blow it up, but they add these 3 constitutional amendments that completely change the name of the game as far as individual rights are concerned, right? And so the process of hammering out the Civil Rights Act of 1866, this was your question, in the past, by historians of Reconstruction and whatever, it's typically represented as like, oh, they're scrambling, it's 1865, they see the Southern states creating these Black laws, and they're like, oh, we've got to do something. And so they pass the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. And what I'm showing is that they came into this with a set of ideas. But I'm not saying that it's all just boring after that. It's not continuous, because they never could have changed the Constitution or implemented a federal civil rights law if it hadn't been for the Civil War and the fact that the Southern states were out of the Union when they did it. Right. So there's a kind of ideological continuity in the civil rights movement that I'm talking about, but there's also a break in terms of how power is exercised in the United States.
Fantastic. I'm going to have to take these people's questions. Let's answer or let's get to some of these questions. Hey there.
Thank you.
Let me look through the questions and find you some good ones. We have lots of questions so far. Okay, so we have a question from William, bringing this up to the present, saying after completing this monumental book, can you possibly weigh in on the controversy raging today about the 1619 project, and the 1776 Patriot Project? Thoughts about how your book is in conversation with the moment that we're in today?
So I, started working on this book more than 10 years ago, long before the 1619 project or the 1776, whatever that was. And I never really was writing it in relation to those, those contemporary dialogues. And I think, one of the things that I want to say, this is one of the things I've been thinking about this controversy. First of all, the teaching of American history has become very politicized right now, although it often has been in the past too. And this isn't the first time that certain kinds of conflicts in American politics or American culture play out on the stage of as a conflict over the teaching of history or the representation of American history. And that is partly because these debates are about, these kind of political debates are also about how we see ourselves as a nation. And oftentimes the teaching and writing of American history is also about how we see ourselves as a nation, except for the fact that I think most historians are actually engaged in trying to find out what happened and answer questions that haven't been answered. And that's not to say that our work or my work isn't political or doesn't have a set of values associated with it. Like I think certain things are good and cool in history and certain things are, terrible in history. But actually I see my job as to answer an interesting question, tell an interesting story that's faithful to the historical record as far as I can tell. And I think that one of the goals of the 1619 project was to change the narrative, was to not necessarily answer a specific question, but to say, like, let's do a thought experiment. What would happen if we all started to think about the founding of the United States as the founding of slavery in British North America instead of 1776? Like, let's try that out, right? And what it's doing is putting the history of slavery and emancipation and African Americans at the center of the story of American history. I think that's a really cool thing to do. I think a lot of people have been doing that for a long time as both as a kind of thought experiment and as a kind of guide for their research and writing. But to kind of put that out there in the New York Times in a very prominent place and have people respond to it, I think is healthy. It's terrific. And no wonder it's challenging to a lot of people. And I don't think that I'm not worried that, people are going to start talking about 1619 and they're going to stop celebrating the 4th of July or something like that, right? I mean, it's not fundamentally a threat to a whole lot of other things that are also part of American narratives. It's just for people who haven't already thought about things this way, let's try this on for size. And I think that, the reaction among the Trump administration and kind of the right wing shows precisely that a lot of Americans do find that threatening, right? That they absolutely do not want to try that out. They don't want to think about it. And I just don't think, and so they're pushing back in this way that, is silencing of actual history, right? So the pushback is that, and the notion that the relationship between teaching history and patriotic education actually really needs to be examined, right? I mean, that it's the notion that what we should be doing as some of this legislation that's on deck in the States right now is history teaching is patriotic education. That is really dangerous, right? You might want to inculcate some version of patriotism in public schools, but that should be an entirely different question from how history is taught, right? History is not about patriotism or unpatriotism. It's about what actually happened and grappling with what happened. And so I'm very worried about what's going on in the States right now and about these attacks on history educators and on history education in general. And And I think that, the hysteria right now around the idea of critical race theory, I mean, all of it is literally is unfounded in terms of having a relationship to what is actually being taught in classrooms. And it's just represents a kind of politicized incursion into the really important work that history educators do. So I'll get off my, soapbox about that. But I mean, I have lots more to say, obviously.
Keeanga, did you want to?
I just wanted to say quickly that, I think that it's also, there's a reason why this country has deliberately left out of its sort of formal national narratives the history of slavery. I mean, there's no national monument or national museum to the history of enslavement in the United States. There is no celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation. There's no celebration of the 1866 Civil Rights Act. There's no celebration of the 13th Amendment. And I think for a long time that we've talked about this as amnesia, which I think is a problem because it indicates that there's something natural in it, and I think preserves this sense of white innocence around the kind of deliberate subjugation of this history. And I think that the reason why it is subjugated is because it has political consequences, which is to say that if this country were truthful about the history of racism and the subjugation of Black people, then it would be obligated to do something. But by suppressing that history, it is allowed to continue to perpetuate this narrative that Black deprivation or the inequality that separates Black life from white life is driven by dysfunctional families, by a culture of poverty, and by other kinds of external factors. If we were to be honest about a history of after slavery, 100 years of legal discrimination, and then after that, changing the law, but not changing the conditions that were created by enslavement and by Jim Crow, then the country would be obligated to do something. The country might be obligated to pay reparations. It might be obligated to follow through on actual programmatic interventions that require us to do things that are politically unpleasant, raising taxes, paying for these things. And so, I think it's important to see this denial and selective memory as connected to a larger way that we govern in the United States, and that it's not, just obtuseness or not knowing because we just don't know and we haven't read the right books, but that the not knowing is organized. And I think that is something to look at in context of what is happening today. The people who are most virulent about the critical race theory hysteria, about the 1619 hysteria, are also people who are connected to a regressive, repressive method of governing that is, really aimed at ignoring these conditions of inequality in this country.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot to think about with, I think that what's really interesting is this sort of long view from pre-Civil War civil rights movements in your book through today, and how much of that has been, as you say, buried in our consciousness. I have another question from Ruth. She says that she's interested in some of the contradictions in the old Northwest states. You mentioned this a little bit earlier, but maybe you could expand on it. She points out Indiana specifically, which you also mentioned, that outlawed slavery in their original constitution, but then passed laws that severely discouraged Black immigration and restricted Black rights and so on. If you could just expand on those sort of dichotomies a little bit.
Well, I mean, and this is probably one of the, I don't want to sound boring. I mean, this might be one of the reasons nobody ever wrote this book before, but, there's a lot of variation state by state. So for example, Ohio comes first. As I said, they kind of set the stage for passing these racially restrictive laws. And yet in their constitution, they include a measure that is extremely anti-slavery, where they say not only is slavery outlawed consistent with the Northwest Ordinance, but also they outlaw long-term indentures. So indentures are a common way of dealing with orphans. I mean, all kinds of people end up indentured in this period in the United States, but it's also a way of keeping formerly enslaved people under control or in a state of quasi-slavery. And so they actually in Ohio seem to have predicted one of the ways that Illinois would later try to extend slavery, but not by the name of slavery. So when Illinois comes along, they permit extremely long-term indentures. And so in early Illinois, you have people who are serving out so-called like 99-year indentures. So they're basically, that means they cannot ever leave their job until they're done with their indenture. Of course, they will be dead by then, right? And it's a way of preserving, and under those conditions in Illinois, people were also bought and sold in a way. They're mortgaged and kind of passed from person to person in wills and things like that. So it was a system somewhat similar to slavery, although unlike in slavery itself, the condition could not be passed down intergenerationally. So anyway, Ohio has a very strong anti-slavery provision. Illinois is much weaker, and there's a much more kind of extended fight in Illinois over these long-term indentures and over slavery, conditions of kind of enslavement that were left over from the French presence in Illinois, particularly in along the Mississippi River. And so like, okay, so you have variation within the Midwestern states themselves, and then you have a diverse populations. And there's also interesting things going on about who chooses to migrate in. I mean, we talked a bit about African-American migration into these states, but early on in the late 18th and early 19th century, some of the white people who move into these old Northwest states, they basically move up across the Ohio River because they are anti-slavery. And they found churches in Southern Ohio, Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, that have become white anti-slavery churches. And this is in the early 19th century. And then those people later, get hooked up with radical abolitionism in the 1830s. There are Quakers in this area too. Turns out that a lot of times African-American migrants deliberately try to settle near white Quakers because those are some of the friendlier white people in these areas. And so all of that is to say that it's really complicated. And none of this boils down to, and I'm not saying complicated as a way of evading making a generalization. It's more that when we think about these places, we have to think about them as being diverse and being attractive to people for different reasons. And then that the politics that plays out in these places represents that kind of diversity. So none of it can be reduced to one thing. And that's why they're very dynamic politically. And that's also what makes it really interesting.
That's great.
Thank you. Well, I think we are just about out of time. Do either of you have one last thought you want to leave us with?
I think this book is really important for the history that it offers, but also if you want to understand some of the tensions around federalism that are still with us today in terms of the conflict between what states are able to do and the difficulty that the federal government has in regulating that, then understand the origins of that and how it played out in an earlier iteration by getting this book. I learned a ton and in an exciting way. So my last thought is get this book.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say thanks, Keeanga, for being here, and thanks to the Newberry Library for hosting this event.
Thank you both so much, Dr. Masur and Dr. Taylor.